we are actually the victims of imperialism since ages. We had being foreign colonies, we had fought imperialism and won our freedoms. With that, we have Professor Prabhat Patnaik, leading world Marxist economist and public intellectual, who will be talking to us about imperialism and how it has been a weapon with the imperialist forces since ages, and also the current US hegemony taking control of world affairs, and how it weaponizes trade and controls independent voices that want to form independent blocks to fight and stay independent. So, Professor Prabhat Patnaik requires no introduction, but I would have to do my role as a chair to introduce him. Professor Prabhat Patnaik is well known over the world as a leading Marxist intellectual, but however, to us, he is dearly professor from Jawaharlal Nehru University, who has nurtured many leading intellectuals on the Marxist framework who are leading in different parts of India in different universities and are also leading different movements. Our departed leader, Sitaram Yechuri, was one of his students. So, you know, the leaders and intellectuals were trained under his guidance. So, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, welcome you on behalf of Tricontinental Asia team. So, I'd request you to please talk to our audience and also share your views and also your little bit disagreement with the US leading intellectual on imperialism. Yeah, thank you. Professor Prabhat Patnaik, you have about 20 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on this session along with my fellow panelists. You see, if one looks at the media reporting, if you look even at a lot of the academic discussion, the general tenor of that discussion is that here was a rule-based international order, but this madman called Donald Trump has come and upset it. So everybody is talking about the fact that, firstly, we had a rule-based order, which is always good to have, and secondly, that Trump is doing this because he is really quite a crazy person. I believe both these propositions are wrong. The rule-based order we had was in fact an imperialist order. There was nothing good about the rule-based order. On the contrary, under that order, vast numbers of peasants, petty producers, working people, particularly in the global south, had actually become absolutely worse off. All this talk about the World Bank saying so many million have been lifted out of poverty and so on is completely nonsensical. As a matter of fact, most of the working people during this entire period of neoliberalism have actually got absolutely worse off, and this is clear from nutritional data. So this was an order which, to start with, was imposed on the global south. It's an imperialist order. And the fact that this imperialist order is something which is now being upset by Donald Trump is not because he's a crazy man, but because a very serious crises have arisen within this order. Let me just look at each of these issues seriatim. Firstly, the problem with the imperialist order. The most significant feature of this order was that unlike the Bretton Woods system that had preceded it, you actually now had a relatively free flow, relatively easy flow of goods and services and of finance and of capital, including finance, across country borders. Now, of course, if finance is mobile across country borders, and at the same time we have nation states, that popular will is reflected in the choice of governments of particular nation states. So we have this situation of a nation state confronting globalized or international finance. And if that is the case, then the writ of international finance must run against the writ of the nation state, because otherwise you will have outflow of finance. Suppose a particular government does not listen to what finance wants it to do. In that case, finance would flow out en masse from that country. So the sovereignty of countries gets compromised, democracy loses its meaning, and popular sovereignty is really replaced by the sovereignty of international finance capital. And that is the order within which we have been functioning. This has very many consequences, particularly for the policies that the government pursues. And one very important consequence is the fact that the kind of support that petty production used to enjoy in the previous regime, before neoliberal order came into being, is something which it no longer does enjoy or can enjoy, because that is not what international finance capital wants it to do. It wants, in fact, big capital to have a kind of freedom to run all over the country and to encroach upon the areas that were hitherto being generally in the domain of petty producers. Now, this has had many consequences. For instance, I'll give you one very obvious consequence. The kind of price support that peasant agriculture used to get from the governments in the earlier period is something which is gone. In India, it still has not gone for food grain producers, because no government has had the guts to withdraw price support from food grain producers. The present government tried to do that, but there was a year-long agitation of farmers which actually prevented it from doing it. The government backed down. But it has withdrawn price support from cash crop producers, because of which now cash crop prices in India move up and down together with international prices, because of which the cash crop producers, they take loans. As you know, you require capital to do some cash crop production. You take a loan, but there's a price crash. As a result, you cannot pay back the loan, and peasants, driven to despair in such a situation, have committed suicide. In fact, there have been large numbers, 400,000 suicides nearly, since the beginning of neoliberalism in India, which was about 3.5 decades ago. So the petty producers, peasant agriculture has been driven to great distress. And likewise, you have, even though India is one of the supposedly a success story of this neoliberal order in the sense of achieving a high rate of GDP growth, what you actually find is that because trade is now relatively open, countries, producers located in different countries are competing against one another for each other's markets. As a result, you find that producers are under compulsion to introduce technological and structural change in the production structure, because of which the rate of growth of labor productivity accelerates greatly, as indeed it has. So that even if you have a high rate of growth of GDP, since the rate of growth of labor productivity accelerates greatly, the rate of growth of employment, which is the difference between the two, is something which actually falls compared to the preceding period. And as a matter of fact, in India, for instance, and in lots of countries of the global south, it has fallen below the natural rate of population growth, which basically means that your labor reserves, far from getting exhausted, your labor reserves actually enlarge as a proportion of the labor force. So because of which the wage rates remain stuck to the subsistence level. And since the labor reserves increase, the average standard of living of a person belonging to the working population tends to go down because the same number of work jobs is now shared out among more people. So this order is one which had been completely inimical as far as the working people were concerned. And this is not just true of the global south. It is obviously true of the global south, but even in the global north, because of the fact that earlier real wages used to rise when labor productivity rose, because there were restrictions on labor mobility to the global north, there were restrictions on capital mobility from north to south, except to service the markets in the global south was very limited. So you actually had a world economy that was segmented. In the segmented world economy, wages in the north rose more or less in tandem with labor productivity. But now that capital is much more mobile to the global south, or had been under neoliberalism, you found that the working class in the advanced countries was competing against the workers in the underdeveloped countries. If they demanded higher wages, then capital would simply flow out, let us say, of the United States to China or to Indonesia or to India or to Vietnam or wherever. Because of which there has been a great weakening in the bargaining strength of the working class in the global north, and therefore wages, real wages, have not increased. As a matter of fact, Stiglitz has shown that the average real earning of a male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower than in 1968, which just shows that actually there has been, in the recent period, actually a lowering of the real wages, and matters have become much worse since then. So if you have the working people both in the north and in the south becoming worse off, while labor productivity is rising, then obviously you find that there's a rise in the share of economic surplus in total global output and in the output of particular countries as well. Now, this rise in the share of economic surplus, one implication of it, which many people like Piketty and others have been talking about, is the fact that there's a tremendous rise in income and wealth inequality. The income inequality increase is directly related, in my view, to the rise in the share of economic surplus. But what is more, since per unit income of the working people, more is consumed compared to the consumption out of of a unit income that accrues as surplus to various people, you find that this distribution shift in favor of the surplus away from wage income is something which actually implies a lowering of consumption per unit of income, taking the economy as a whole, taking the world economy as a whole, and therefore the onset of an overproduction crisis. This crisis was somewhat kept in check because of the various asset price bubbles in the US earlier, but after the collapse of those bubbles, the world economy has been exposed to a crisis of overproduction. This crisis of overproduction cannot be overcome in the standard Keynesian manner, as is often believed it could be, for the simple reason that, again, for the state to for state intervention to overcome this crisis, government spending has to be financed either by a fiscal deficit or by taxes on the rich. If you tax the working people and the government actually spends the tax proceeds, then the working people are consuming most of the amount they pay as taxes anyway. So their consumption simply gets replaced by expenditure by the government. There's no net increase in aggregate demand. But both these ways of financing government expenditure, which could increase aggregate demand, namely through either a tax on the rich, wealth tax, or corporate profits tax, or through a larger fiscal deficit, are anathema as far as international finance capital is concerned, because of which no government is really in a position to overcome this crisis either on its own or by coordinating itself off from the encroachment of, from the effect of international finance capital. Now, in this kind of a situation, you actually find that any crisis, which means a slowing down of the growth of GDP, would enlarge the fiscal deficit of the government. In any period, let us say, government expenditure is given, and suppose output drops, then tax revenue drops, and therefore the fiscal deficit rises. Not surprisingly, in any period of crisis, spontaneously there is an increase in fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP. But at that point, international finance insists that fiscal deficit must be curtailed. And if fiscal deficit is to be curtailed, one very obvious way of doing it is not by raising taxes on the domestic population, because that would invite for the government a certain unpopularity, but by imposing higher tariffs. Tariffs are a form of taxes, and not surprisingly, therefore, Trump has raised tariffs. Now, this has a further kind of thing to recommend it from the point of view of American imperialism. British imperialism, you see, any leader of the imperialist world has to have a current account deficit on the balance of payments vis-a-vis other leading members, other major powers, because that way you actually provide a market for them and they don't rebel against your leadership. British imperialism had done this in the period before the First World War. Both continental Europe and the United States, which were actually advanced countries or emerging advanced countries of that period, were countries with which Britain had a current account deficit. But Britain managed to have this current account deficit and even make capital exports, because it had huge amounts of resources it drained away from its colonies without any quid pro quo. It simply looted these proceeds from its colonies. Additionally, it also made exports which were of the deindustrializing kind, textile exports to India and China, which basically was at the expense of the local craft producers. As a result, through deindustrializing exports and trade, Britain could manage to make not only meet her balance of payments deficits, but even make capital exports. Now, the US has not had any access to those colonies. And of course, colonialism in today's world would not be able to give you those kinds of resources, because after all, as Rosa Luxemburg pointed out, there's a limit to which you can actually expand your colonial empire. And once your craftsmen have been deindustrialized, there's no further scope for deindustrializing them, and so on. So the US in the post-Second World War period has been the leader of the imperialist countries, but without having any access to the kind of colonial loot and colonial markets that Britain had, because of which the US fairly soon has got into a current account deficit. The current account deficit of the US has increased over time. And of course, in a world in which the world market is not growing because Keynesian demand management is not possible, you find that the only way that a country can provide greater employment for its own working people is through what is called beggar thy neighbor policies. Now, beggar thy neighbor policies basically had been pursued in 1930s. They basically mean that you export unemployment from your country to some other country, and this was done in that period through competitive exchange rate depreciations. In today's world, this is being tried through competitive tariff policies. If the US imposes a tariff, but other countries do not retaliate, that basically means that the US market is available now exclusively to US producers and the market is denied to others. That basically means that others' level of activity and employment goes down. So US employment would increase at their expense, which basically means that there is an export of unemployment. So this tariff policy that we are seeing, competitive tariffs we are seeing today, are really a competitive beggar thy neighbor policies. So tariffs have an advantage from the point of view of the US economy, in the sense that, first of all, they close or reduce the fiscal deficit. Secondly, they reduce the current account deficit. Thirdly, they increase domestic activity and employment. But all this they do if there's no retaliation. If there's a retaliation to the US tariffs, in that case, they don't get these advantages. On the other hand, the price level in the world as a whole goes up relative to money wages, because of which the crisis gets accentuated. What is going to happen in the coming days is that countries of the global south in particular would be the victims of US tariffs. I think China has already retaliated against the American tariffs, and I'm sure European Union would also carry some retaliatory measures, because of which fundamentally it is countries of the global south that would be left to the mercy of this US beggar thy neighbor policies. But that is basically something which would reduce employment in the global south, therefore reduce real earnings of workers in the global south, and in countries that are already indebted, that would increase, in a sense, effective burden of debt on those countries. So I find that the global south is going to be particularly a victim of Trump's tariffs. And these tariffs are not just crazy things. On the contrary, they, as I told you, constitute a measure on the part of the US to overcome the crisis as far as its own economy is concerned. Now here, therefore, I would suggest that instead of harking back to a rule-based order, which was not really particularly beneficial for the global south, was actually an imperial dominated order, the global south should actually be now taking steps to break out of this entire, both the original order as well as what Trump has made of it. And I think that it can do by small countries coming together to form economic unions, so that you have trade that takes place between them, having bilateral agreements within global south for meeting their own requirements, getting rid of this whole idea of settling your transactions through dollar payments, but rather having bilateral agreements where one country can have a claim upon another, and that claim can be settled over a period of time, but the dollar can be removed as a medium of exchange. So it is time that home markets are developed. And if home markets have to be developed, then the governments have to be activated. And if governments have to be activated, then you have to have some kind of control on capital flows, and therefore a delinking of countries of the global south from the order, not only Trump's order, but the order that even prevented. This delinking requires substantial, it's not going to be easy, it's very difficult. It requires, therefore, substantial political support from the workers and peasants and the working people. And to earn that political support, it is important for the left to, in fact, promise a new world in which at least a welfare state in the form of the introduction of fundamental, justiciable, constitutionally guaranteed economic rights are introduced universally for all citizens. I would say that this is perfectly feasible. I would like to see economic rights, including the right to food, right to employment, right to free universal health care along a national health service, right to free publicly funded education, and right to a living old age pension and disability benefits. These are things that can be put on an agenda to mobilize people, because of which then we can actually break out both of the Trump's new order as well as the old order that Trump is replacing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Prabhat Patnaik. I request everyone, if you have questions or you have comments, please use the chat box either on the Zoom account or on the platforms where we are streaming live on Facebook and as well as the YouTube space. Now we have Professor Radhika Desai who will be speaking to us. Before I invite her to speak, let me briefly introduce her. Professor Radhika Desai is professor of political studies at University of Manitoba. She's also the convener of International Manifesto Group and director of Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the university. Her interests are varied from political science to political theory to contemporary party politics. But what interests us from tricontinental Asia is her forthcoming book, Hindutva and the Political Economy of Indian Capitalism. Ma'am, we are eagerly waiting for that book to come out. Yeah, Professor Radhika Desai, you have about 20 to 25 minutes to share your views on the topic. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Baker. I will try to keep to that deadline. In fact, let me know when I have 5 minutes left. Yeah, so, and thank you also for inviting me and inviting me also to share a panel with Prabhat, which is always, I mean, I think this is probably the first time I've shared the same platform as Prabhat. I've invited him to speak, but anyway, it's great pleasure and great honor. Okay, so we are being asked to speak about imperialism and the weaponization of trade, and I just like to make give you some understanding of the way I look at it, and then speak more specifically about exactly how to understand this tempest of tariffs that Trump has unleashed. So that's going to be my focus. So basically, since we are also talking about imperialism and the weaponization of trade, let me start with my understanding of imperialism, which I've developed in in a way of understanding, in a new approach to understanding world affairs that I've called geopolitical economy, and I've published a book in 2013 and more recently in 2023. Describing this approach and developing this approach. And according to this, in my view, imperialism, of course, is inevitable in capitalism. It arises, in fact, from the fact that capitalism suffers from contradictions. And the state has to therefore always be actively involved in managing these contradictions, whether through domestic activity by regulating industry or making concessions to the working class or what have you, and also through international action by essentially trying to impose the consequences of its imperialism on other countries, essentially putting the burden of these contradictions on other countries. So the state is always centrally involved. So imperialism, therefore, is the international aspect of dealing with capitalism's contradictions. And this understanding things this way requires that we essentially understand take the approach of political economy and geopolitical economy rather than separating politics from economics. The two are always connected. Imperialism is not something that is political, which then, in exceptional circumstances, weaponizes trade. That's not what happens. Imperialism has always been about weaponizing economic relations. So I'll just quickly share, this is the book that I wrote in 2013, Geopolitical Economy, and my more recent book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. And the way in which I understand capitalism's contradictions is to understand that value production, which is the essence of capitalism, which is essentially what capital requires, is essentially composed of two axes, essentially. So the vertical axis over which surplus is extracted from the working class, and a horizontal axis of competition, which depresses prices closer to the to values. So so these are the essentially and the whole process of value production is inherently contradictory. I won't go into this, but I regard capitalism as suffering from two types of contradictions across a whole range of realms, not just production and realization, which are the core realms of capitalist accumulation, but across them in other spheres as well. And they also take an international form in the form of competition among capitalist countries and the dialectic of domination and resistance between capitalist countries and their imperialized the subordinated countries. So essentially, I think of capitalism as is living in a kind of imperial cocoon in which in which that cocoon serves a couple of purposes. First, there are inputs, that is, capitalism demands from that cocoon cheap labor and cheap inputs, whether it's in the form of raw materials or intermediate products or even finished products, wage goods, etc. And it requires the cocoon to also accept its excess commodity and excess capital. Although I agree with the work that Prabhat and Utsa have done and have recently emphasized that in the more recent times, really, given the extent to which they have destroyed the capacity of the third world to consume, these output elements are perhaps less important in today's imperialism than the input aspects. Okay, so if you then accept that imperialism, sorry, what am I doing? Stop share. Okay. Imperialism has always weaponized economic relations or material productive relations. You can give many examples of it. Prabhat named many, and I've listed some of them. Some of them ones I'm going to list are overlaps with his. So fundamentally, I think of imperialism as the denial of development. Imperialism essentially subordinates or essentially treats the economic territories as essentially like punching bag of capitalism, which has to accept everything that that the contradictions of capitalism issue to the rest of the world, whereas and the purpose of that is to support the development of the mother countries, and the result is the denial of development to the colonies and semi-colonies. There has been, of course, the history of one-way free trade, the history of deindustrialization, the history of construction of railways which are designed for extraction. There has been, of course, as Prabhat pointed out, taxation, tribute extraction, etc., etc. And then there's a further point, which is that you see, in relations among the major capitalist countries, at least in the period between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, a roughly 100-year period, seem to be conducted on the basis of certain standards of civilization, in which, even in the case of some wars that may take place, etc., economic relations tended to continue as before. Economic relations were not weaponized, and it's a sign of the fact, sign of how serious the crisis of capitalism and imperialism had become, that these niceties were suspended with the onset of the First World War. But this sort of idea that you would not weaponize economic relations never applied to third world countries. There were always so-called standards of civilization assumptions that were made that ensured that, sorry, I just want to share my slide here, that ensured that as far as the colonial countries were concerned, there were no such restraints on the behavior of capitalist countries. And this goes back to the earliest of Enlightenment thinking. So, for example, Immanuel Kant in his Perpetual Peace, which is generally regarded as this great tract, looking forward to a peaceful world and, even condemning imperialism and so on. But he inserts in there the critical proviso. So he argues that the rule that one cannot take hostile action against anyone unless one has been actively injured by them only applies to situations where both parties are living in a legal civil state. These are his words. But this legal civil state is essentially accepting capitalism, accepting the rule of private property and everything that follows. And then he continues and he says, but man or an individual people in a mere state of nature robs me of any security and injures me by this very state in which he coexists with me. He may not have injured me actively, but he does injure me by the very lawlessness of his state. Here, the lawlessness is simply a set of laws that do not correspond to the laws of capitalism. For he is a permanent threat to me, and I can require him to enter into a common lawful state along with me or to move away from my vicinity. So, this essentially means that as far as all the pre-capitalist world was concerned, which did not have the legal relations of capitalism and so on and so forth, could have those relations imposed on them. So in that sense, it was, what I'm trying to suggest is that imperialism was always about imposing a certain type of economic relations on another group. So, and of course, the work of Anthony Anglin in terms of international law has also been extremely useful in thinking about this. So in that sense, then what is different today is not, and here, this kind of overlaps with the argument that Prabhat made, which is that, what is new is not that they are using tariffs and so on. There has never been a rules-based international order and so on. So what is different today is not the weaponization of trade, but really the stage in the history of imperialism that we are at. So what is this stage? So I would say, and again, I'm going to give a very compressed version of the arguments that I've made in my the two books, particularly that I mentioned in other writings. But very briefly, you can think of capitalist imperialism, which of course is rooted in pre-capitalist imperialism, but comes into its own in the late 18th, 19th centuries. Comes to a peak in 1914. That is the high point of imperialism. And this, it's also important to underline that this coincides with the capitalism having arrived at the monopoly phase. And this is important because Marx had clearly foreseen that once capitalism arrived at its monopoly phase, which it had already done by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it would no longer be historically progressive. It would have exhausted whatever historically progressive function it had of socializing labor, even though capitalism does it brutally, does it anarchically, based on exploitation, etc. And Marx argued that it would have then, at that point, becomes ripe for socialism. And I've also written a piece in which I show that when Lenin talked about imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism. And a lot of people dismiss this argument, pointing to especially the post-Second World War boom, which I'll come to in a minute, and say, clearly Lenin was wrong, capitalism had a lot of life left in it, etc., etc. But in reality, certainly for now, this is important, which is that Lenin is doing nothing much more than developing this idea of Marx's, that by the time the monopoly stage is reached, whatever historical progressiveness that capitalism may have had is exhausted. It is finished. It's ripe for socialism. And this point had also been further developed by Hilferding in his Finance Capital. And Lenin is, and which of course, as we know, had influenced Lenin a great deal. So Lenin is simply developing this in a myriad ways. It's fascinating, as I say, I quote Lenin chapter and verse in terms of the elaborate way in which he develops this argument. So the golden age, of course, is regarded as, people think, oh, well, look, during the golden age, there was so much growth. So how can you say that capitalism had already reached its highest phase in 1916 when Lenin wrote his pamphlet on imperialism? But in reality, it's important for us. It's extremely important for us today, after 4.5 decades of neoliberalism, to really reassess what the golden age was all about. During the golden age itself, a lot of people did say that capitalism had been transformed and so on, and many Marxists came up and pointed out, well, this is not true. Western countries remain capitalist and so on and so forth, and it was important to emphasize that. But from the point of view of today, we have to emphasize something else. So let me explain what that something else is. The growth of the golden age was in fact due to the fact that, as anticipated by many people, sorry, I have to Okay. As anticipated by many important thinkers, including people like Keynes or Polanyi, but also people like Hayek. Keynes or Polanyi would have welcomed it. Hayek feared the same thing. Everybody thought that by the end of the Second World War, the world would essentially turn away from capitalism, adopt some kind of socialism. But in reality, so people say, well, this did not happen. But if you think about it, in reality, okay, the world did not turn socialist, but it did go substantially in that direction. There was, of course, communism, which stretched from Eastern Europe all the way to the other end of the Eurasian landmass. There was newly independent countries that had adopted one or the other form of left-leaning socialistic form of development. And in the first world countries themselves, you had Keynesian welfare states. And the kinds of constraints that this put on capitalism was what gave that period and particularly by massively expanding demand, this is what gave that period its benign and productively dynamic character. And this is doubly underlined when you see that when the underlying capitalism of the first world countries nevertheless, eventually ran into crisis, the stagflationary crisis of the 1970s, and then the road out of that crisis was, the Western capitalism stood at a fork in the road. Should we deepen these reforms, the Keynesian social welfare state reforms, or should we repeal them? And the neoliberal option, the latter option, was taken. And now we've had, several decades during which countries have stuck to these neoliberal policies, no matter their disastrous consequences. What we see very clearly is that removing these constraints from capital has not made capital more productive. The neoliberalism was sold by saying, if you remove the dead hand of the state, then capitalism will reacquire its, mojo, and it will be reinvigorated and so on. But in fact, we have seen that that after 1980, growth rates have systematically been lower and investment rates have systematically been lower in the Western capitalist world than during the golden age. So the golden age was therefore not the productive dynamism of the golden age should not be attributed to capitalism, but to the extent to which it was reformed. And so if you accept that, then what is clear is that 4 decades of neoliberalism, which has given freedom to monopoly capital, has not unlocked the productive dynamism of capital. It has merely given freedoms to a senile capitalism, which is not capable of becoming vigorous, and therefore uses the freedoms that it has been given for the essentially unproductive, speculative, financializing types of activities. And so capitalism is today in its senile declining phase, and many would argue, and I certainly believe there's a lot of substance to this, it is being outcompeted, particularly by socialist China and its socialistic development. And elsewhere, where countries do deviate from neoliberalism, that has been good. You could argue that whereas once capitalism weaponized trade to subordinate the rest of the world, today it is doing it as part of its very deep crisis. And so now I come to what that crisis consists of. So Trump should not be seen, Trump got elected by telling American voters that I'm going to resolve this crisis you're in. But in reality, he cannot resolve the crisis. He is a symptom of the crisis. He's not an actor in the crisis. And his election the second time shows just how deep the crisis actually goes. So Trump has essentially introduced tariffs for a bunch of very contradictory reasons. And there is no, a lot of people have tried to see some sort of method in his madness, but I do not see any. I think I see only madness. And that madness is not Trump's individual psychological madness. It arises from the structural situation of which he is a symptom. So the first thing you have to understand about Trump and tariffs is that Trump understood one thing, and he told one truth to American voters. For the previous decade or so, Democrats had tried to essentially had been telling American voters that their economy was doing very well, when in fact it was not. And American voters knew it from their personal experience. So Trump figured out that you can't win elections by telling Americans that their economy is doing well. So he told them the truth. He said, your economy is not doing well. But of course, this truth was then accompanied by a lie, because, of course, what it would really take to resolve the problems, which would be very similar to the sorts of proposals with which Prabhat ended, would of course be directly contrary to the interests of the capitalist class. So, in order to essentially not contradict the interests of the capitalist class, Trump therefore accompanied this truth with a big lie. He didn't tell American voters that the reason for their misery is 4 decades and counting of neoliberal economic policies that had not revived capitalism, that had only led to deindustrialization and financialization. He said, no, the reason for your misery is China, trade, and the immigrants. And so this is the lie basis of which he's got elected. And to a very important extent, this hyperactivity around tariffs is simply a way of trying to show that he is fulfilling promises. Of course, Trump also has a rather nostalgia about tariffs. You know, he harks back to a time when bulk of American taxes, American government revenues actually came from taxes. You can see here that until about the First World War, this yellow bit here is essentially tariff revenues. So until the First World War, there were no income taxes. Tariffs constituted the bulk of American revenues, and he wishes he could abolish income tax, corporate tax, etc., back to an era where there would be tariffs. Of course, there's a big contradiction here, because he also claims that the tariffs are going to reindustrialize the United States. But if tariffs really did reindustrialize the United States, then they would not produce the revenues that they are supposed to produce, because Americans would not buy foreign products to the same extent, and therefore there would be no tariff payments. Certainly, however, there is another aspect to this tax angle, and that is that there's another aspect to this tax angle, and that is that he will use these expected revenues coming from tariffs to justify further tax cuts for the rich, which is only going to put the American economy and ordinary American workers in a deeper crisis. It's not like Trump really cares about them. They have done what they need them to do, which is they have voted him into power. Now he doesn't. He doesn't care what happens to them. This idea that somehow tariffs are going to reindustrialize the United States, I think this is yes, it's true that tariffs have historically been part of industrialization efforts in the form of infant industry protection and so on. Yeah, I'll finish in about 3 or 4 minutes. Yeah, infant industry protection and so on. But sorts of tariffs have to be used as part of a larger industrial strategy designed, which has identified the sectors that are going to be priorities for industrialization and imposes selective tariffs on them, not these blanket tariffs, which themselves have been imposed on the basis of completely harebrained calculations about exactly how the United States is suffering from these tariffs and so on. So essentially, there is not much method in this madness. The fate of Trump's tariffs will be governed by about 4 factors that I can immediately think of. Number one, of course, tariffs will be inflationary, and this will increase popular disaffection. And this, of course, like I said, Trump doesn't care, but there will be the issue of the midterm elections. There knows perhaps elements of the Republican Party might actually have the option to try to stop Trump. No, we have to see. Trump certainly has a lot of control over the Republican Party, so we'll have to see whether this actually happens or not. Secondly, CEOs of various American corporations that rely on supply chains that serve the whole world, and particularly go to China, they will, of course, be complaining to Trump. They have already done so. Again, I would say that one already reads in the newspapers that many CEOs are afraid stepping out of line vis-a-vis Trump. So the extent to which this will happen is anybody's guess. And of course, there are also market ructions. And as you see, Trump announced this 90-day truce in his tariff war after markets went a little haywire. when he announces his so-called Liberation Day tariffs. Trump will also find that tariffs are ineffective in intimidating opponents. And that there's one very simple reason for it, which I'd also like to share with you. Where's my, okay, here we go. And that is that, well, actually, I don't have to show it, I'll just explain it to you. Trump basically imagines that the whole world will sort of be very afraid if he threatens to impose tariffs and so on, because he imagines that the world is dependent on the United States market to a far greater extent than it really is. So if we look at this chart of the United States share of world imports, you see here that in 2012, for example, the United States still accounted for some 18.2% of world imports. But by 2022, this had shrunk to about 16%, as you see here. So the share, and then, of course, countries like Canada and Mexico are particularly vulnerable to this. I would say that certainly China will essentially be able to withstand the shock, and it will be able to diversify its economic relations away from the United States. So yeah, and so overall, I would say that it seems to me that the effect of these tariffs will be simply sideline the United States in the international system as countries that have been received a shock of Trump's tariffs, and of course the level of uncertainty that Trump has imposed on the world will simply decrease their engagement with the United States and increase it with more predictable, viable economic and trade. So that's what I wanted to say. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Radhika Desai. I request everyone to please share your questions in the chat boxes available on the different platforms. Now we have Professor Dr. Ahilan Kadir Gamar, who is actually an engineer by training but went on to do a PhD in anthropology. He is currently a faculty at University of Jaffna in the sociology department. His interests are on economic sociology, political economy, and cooperatives and agrarian social structure. He's a regular contributor to popular media, the Daily Mirror, and part of various academic journals as an honorary editor. And he's also part of Ideas, which is a group of progressive economists. Dr. Ahilan, are you here with us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. So you have about 20 to 25 minutes. So when you're reaching last 5 minutes, I'll raise my hand. So that's an indication for you to wrap up. You'll have exactly 5 minutes. Yeah. Thank you, Professor.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to this forum. What I'm going to do is make a few assertions about the current global order as it relates to imperialism, and then perhaps speak from the position of Sri Lanka to see how this shift looks like and whether that can provide us any new insights. But at the outset, as I start, I want to start with a quote from Marx, because in this time of great global turmoil, possibly an unraveling global order, there's a tendency to look at what happens in the great centers of power. But at the same time, we should not lose sight of what we should be focusing on as well. So Marx in the Communist Manifesto, towards the end of chapter 1, he says, though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all, settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. I say this because sometimes, there's a tendency to think that by aligning with one great power or the other, or one regional power, that we could confront the kind of exploitation and dispossession that comes with the capitalist global order, or even with imperialist assertions. But I want to place the emphasis on the kind of struggles that we have to take forward within each of our own countries. So I'll start with a few provocative assertions, which we could possibly discuss further. The way I see the current global order, and I would say it's in a process of unraveling, not that there was any kind of rule-based order as such, but nevertheless, from time to time, the global order shifts, unravels, and then consolidates again. And I think this is a time of such flux. So from what was perhaps more of an informal empire of the US, flexible in its way, than perhaps the way in which the British Empire carried out its large structure, where the US itself promoted free trade, the free flow of capital, and so on. There is now a shift towards a more harder, intrusive empire in the making. And this, I would say, is a shift from a certain form of hegemonic leadership of the global order to more direct forms of exploitation. In other words, we could possibly expect even more of military interventions in this process of extraction. The second point I want to make, or an assertion, is that this signals the end, or these times, the 2020s, possibly signals the end of the latest stage of capitalism, and by the latest stage, I mean neoliberalism, right? Neoliberalism as a class project of finance capital that pushed for the free flow of goods, of capital, and emphasizing a certain form of individualism. That project is in the process of shifting. Trump's trade shock is not an isolationist move, right? So it's not the US suddenly becoming isolationist. I see it as a new form of extraction, because there's also going to be much greater military interventions and the kind of flexing of its military muscles, along with these tariffs and imports. All of this, in a way, the fourth point I want to make is that all of this is towards a form of imperial rent based on trade. Now, there have been different forms of rent that have been deployed on the global south. I think over the last 4 or 5 decades, what we saw more extensively is extraction through finance, through debt, and from that now a new move to extract this huge imperial rent in the form of tariffs, but again, backed by military power. So if there is this shift, how does it look like from the vantage point of a small country, a small state? And I want to sort of use the example of Sri Lanka, which its history and its politics I know much better, and it's political economy, to kind of walk you through in the next few minutes. How does this shift look like? Sri Lanka at independence in 1948, when it was under, got its independence from British colonialism. Our finance minister at that time, J.R. Jayawardena, did not go to London. He went to Washington to get the support of the Federal Reserve to form the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. The John Exter, a Federal Reserve officer, came and formed that, wrote a report on the need for a central bank, where he said, now you have got sovereignty, political sovereignty, but you have not got monetary sovereignty, and therefore you need a central bank. And that's the way in which he justified it, because Sri Lankan rupee was still linked to the pound sterling, and to bring it into this a different kind of global monetary order. Now, interestingly, even though he claimed he was for monetary sovereignty, he ended up becoming the first governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka as well, and which tells you the story of how the United States maintained that informal empire, as I would put it. But from time to time, there were these kinds of moves by the United States in Sri Lanka. When Sri Lanka went into an import substitution regime, there was a capital strike. They refused to finance Sri Lanka until, of course, the same man who was the finance minister and brought the US Federal Reserve, when he came to power in 1977, J.R. Jayawardena, and made Sri Lanka the first country to liberalize its economy and move towards a neoliberal order, when the largest development project was given to Sri Lanka in the form by the World Bank, called the Accelerated Mahavali Project. So those kinds of the kind of carrots and sticks that are used by this informal empire have always existed. Then by the mid-2000s, about 20 years ago, around the time of the global financial crisis, Sri Lanka was enticed into floating international sovereign bonds, became much more integrated with global capital markets, and its extraction took place there. Now, all of you know that 3 years ago, Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt for the first time in its history. And when it defaulted, the question before Sri Lanka was, so what does a country do? Do you have to then restructure your debt and repay, or do you take a different path? And the kind of, in discussions here, in the back of some of our head was, well, there is this ultimate, if all that global debt was coming from New York and London, the ultimate weapon, in the old days, there was gunboat diplomacy when countries did not repay their debt. But here, the sort of ultimate weapon that the West could use is that the bulk of our exports, the majority of our exports, goes to the United States and Europe. So if they were to block our exports, we would not be able to survive. So that was the ultimate weapon we thought that they would use in the context of that Sri Lanka does not repay its debt. But interestingly, I think during the last few weeks, that weapon has now been brought out, because what is new is that the Trump regime is ready to take off the mask in terms of how they would use their power. So what would be the consequence of this high level of tariffs? Now, about a fourth of Sri Lanka's exports are to the United States, mainly in the form of garments. Almost 350,000 workers are in the garment sector, and about 50% of our garment exports goes to the United States. A 44% tariff would mean a huge loss of that market, possibly a shift of this footloose industry that garments is to other places if there was a difference in the level of tariffs. And of course, already the garment sector, the business community, is already asserting that they cannot continue, and they are throwing people out of jobs. And what Prabhat mentioned in terms of the expansion of the labor reserves is already taking place, which would then push wages down. But it would not only push wages down in this race to the bottom, it would also push the wages of other countries producing these same goods. In that kind of a scenario, what we are seeing is, at least from the vantage point of Sri Lanka, and I think it's true for so many countries in the global south, smaller countries certainly, almost half the countries, over 70 countries are in debt distress. If extraction through debt hasn't been possible, now we might be in a new phase of extraction through tariffs, both for the financial class in the United States, both through the changes that are brought about in the current account, as well as in terms of being able to reduce the fiscal deficit and also reduce taxes. Now, the question for me is, what is going to be the changes for global finance if it is not going to be this free-floating global finance where the borders in the United States in terms of trade are becoming much more stronger, if it would continue to support finance in the United States, finance capital in the United States, what would happen to finance capital in Europe, for example? So it is this question, would there be, with this shift in the global order in terms of trade, would there also be a shift in the global order in relation to finance, is a question that I think we need to think about. So in the global context, one, I would say there's possibly going to be a shift from extraction through debt to more towards extraction through trade. But what is the implication? Here, again, I very much agree with Prabhat that countries like Sri Lanka, smaller states, have to have much more of an emphasis on self-sufficiency. The push all along was to create some kind of a export-led miracle, often pointing to East Asia, which was in a very different period of a different global order where the US priorities and US hegemony worked very differently. Now that myth has been shattered. So there needs to be a focus on self-sufficiency in countries like ours. And there has to be, again, I think drawing from Samir Amin and others, and what Prabhat also mentioned, a move towards delinking. And delinking here, where relations of much more equal character between smaller states, because this is not the 1950s and 1960s, even though this year we remember the legacy of Bandung in 1955, 70 years later. The capitals in the global south are just as extractive, and they were just as neoliberal in a sense, with finance capital there doing the work. And I don't see them leading this project unless there's major changes in the centers of the global south, including BRICS. The broader point, and I think I draw on what Radhika was also saying, is there was a rule of colonial deference, as maybe Partha Chatterjee and Anthony Angie have talked about. And that the so-called rules-based order always had that rule of deference when it came to the West and the global South. US hegemony stitched together with the US providing the leadership to the West and Japan over the last 70 years, 78 years. Now that seems to be unraveling. And is this also going to be a time of inter-imperialist rivalry without that kind of unipolar hegemony? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahilan. To the three panelists, if there are more questions, please do share in the chat boxes. We have quite a number of questions, so while I gather from my position as a chair, I take this liberty to ask three of you different questions. To Professor Prabhat Patnaik, if you see the questions mostly are on China being, is it still a socialist country, and so on and so forth. But my question to you is, on the debate of imperialism, why do the scholars from the West not see it in the classical sense that imperialism is understood, especially David Harvey and others? They see it no more in that sense. So I would want your comments on that. And Professor Radhika, in the presentation, you talked about having, while in our chat, you talked about you were following the elections in Canada. I want to know your comments on the inter-rivalry between Canada and the US, especially because when I'm speaking to some scholars from Canada, Comrade August, he told that the Canadians state inherently is anti-US. So if you could throw some light on that, how they're going to play with the tariffs being imposed on them. And to Dr. Ahilan, thanks to your presentation, I wanted to know from you that how can smaller countries with the experience of Sri Lanka, which is focusing on export related market, but these products that can be easily replaced by other countries, because these are not products that are technically needed by the imperialist or the major markets, because the garments and agricultural products, they can go to different markets and in a short period of time can get the required goods. So how do smaller countries then focus inwards for self-sufficiency? Can you give examples of the present government that has come to Sri Lanka with People's Mandate what plans they have for on that front. Yeah. Now I would read out the different questions that have been asked by our audience on different platform. Yeah. Just give me a moment. So this is from Abhilash. This question to Professor Patnaik and Professor Desai. Can you expect this trade war to evolve into a situation where inter-imperialist rivalries will become significant again? If so, can global labor and solidarity be strengthened again through traditional Leninist strategies or newer innovative forms of struggle? Yeah. If you want me to read out all the questions or you want to answer one question at a time, yeah. If that is clear to me, maybe then I can proceed. Professor Prabhat, you want the questions all at once or?
Well, I suppose the questions which are addressed to me, perhaps you could tell them that there can't be that many, maybe a
They're
couple
quite a
more.
lot. They're quite a lot.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, whatever you decide.
Okay, then let's go with how we started the presentation. Let's go in that order. So, Professor Prabhat, there's one
Okay.
question. Yeah, I'll read out the questions. This is from
Okay.
Sushanta from Bangladesh. He talks about with your I quote, thanks Professor Prabhat Patnaik, presentation, beautiful presentation and thought-provoking speech. It is unleashing a mammoth work for left organizers and parties. So the question is, in the motion of global capitalism, will they give some breathing space for advance in their dominance, or there will not be any space? What will be the pragmatic steps the political action of global left, especially in global south, should take? And what steps do the BRIC countries take in the working of the global south? Then there is Priyanti from, again to you, Professor. Uh, so what do you think can be the global solidarity for the smaller countries and de-dollarization as basis for surviving and making the best opportunity that Trump actions have created? Then what might be the best scenario if there has been a socialist camp in the world? This is for the three of you. Then there's this Sudeep from Nepal. He happens to be a student, Sudeep Shrestha. He has, how do you see the future result of trade war between Trump's USA and China? Is Trump's trade war last weapon to retain hegemony in the world order? What will the effects of trade war in South Asia, especially on small states like Nepal, whose economy is based on remittance and import tariff? But then there is another question, especially on India, from Suvala for Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Last week, India and USA signed an agreement on agriculture amidst the tariff war and its impacts. How does the agreement benefit farmers and what losses from agriculture may occur in the Indian agriculture sector from this agreements? Yeah. Then, yeah, we can come back to the other questions later, Professor.
Okay, let me, because of the shortage of time, let me quickly go through them. About China being socialist, from my student days, we have been engaged in this debate. Those days, we used to debate whether the Soviet Union was socialist or whether it was state capitalist or whatever. I think these debates are fairly meaningless at the moment. Basically, our enmity is with imperialism. China is a potential friend and ally in the struggle against imperialism for the global south. And that's very important. So to talk in terms of China as being a capitalist country and therefore no different from the USA and so on is something which I totally reject. On the contrary, one can think of China as a potential ally. Why people like David Harvey don't see imperialism is a question that should really be asked to David Harvey, not to me. But just one general comment is that I think a lot of the Western left is unaware of the entire damage which this world order does to the peasantry, because they don't understand the peasantry, they don't see a peasantry and so on. And as while in our country half the population consists of basically agriculture dependent population, so the kind of harm that it does is something which is not visible to them, which is why they tend to underestimate the impact of imperialism. Inter-imperialist rivalries. No, I think it's very important to see that, when Lenin was writing about inter-imperialist rivalries, he was talking about finance capitals based on different countries. The French finance capital, British finance capital, German finance capital, and so on. While today what you have is really globalized finance capital. I don't think globalized finance capital would be keen on having any breakup of the world into different segments. And as a result, I think inter-imperialist rivalry in that sense, namely the coming together of states and finance, in particular metropolitan economies, in order to carve out a sphere of influence for themselves, is something which is really on the agenda. What you would have, of course, is conflicts between the different advanced countries or between advanced countries and the global south and so on. But conflicts is not the same as inter-imperialist rivalry. Okay. Then about the question of breathing space, you see, fundamentally, the idea of export-led growth was a completely bogus idea. Why? Because of the fact that all the arguments for export-led growth assume Say's law. They assume that whatever is produced can be exported. Okay, if only you happen to be competitive. They do not see a demand constraint on exports. This used to be passed off in the old days as what is called the small country assumption, that we assume that every country is a small country and a small country can sell as much as it likes. But you see, once you recognize that the world market has a limited size, then export-led growth, if it is successful, for India, it would be at the expense of Sri Lanka, at the expense of some other country of the global south. So export-led growth is a way of making countries of the global south fight against one another for a given size of the world market, which I don't think is really a very desirable policy to pursue. It's very important, therefore, for the global south or countries of the global south to develop their home markets by developing their agriculture, by developing, by improving income distribution domestically, by raising wages domestically and so on, because of which then their home markets would increase and production would then follow in order to cater to this home market. Now, of course, I see that large numbers of countries are very small and therefore they cannot really grow on the basis entirely of their home market. They also cannot lack the capacity to be diversified economies. But I think in such cases, it's very important for small countries, as I mentioned, to come together in order to form larger blocks. I see the formation of economic unions within, let's say, African countries or within, let us say, South Asia or within other countries, so that I think small countries can come together either with large countries or even on their own in order to form sizable economic units which can then pursue growth based on an expansion of the home market. Now, that is exactly also the way I would answer this question about China, namely that, trade war between China and the US. You see, I think China is a country that has the enormous size of the home market, and therefore China can actually withdraw progressively from this kind of strategy of export-led growth to a strategy of home market-led growth, which it has been doing to some extent, which of course in the Mao period it was doing, and which then it gave up for some time, but I think now increasingly it is doing for some time. And I think China therefore can very well sustain a high growth rate without necessarily getting into any difficulties. Now, dollarization, you see, again, as I was saying, that the dollar has to be prevented from its role as the international medium of circulation. I think the more we have, let us say, a home market-based growth, the more we have countries of the global south coming together to form unions, the more we have bilateral trade agreements within the global south between the different countries to meet their requirements. Suppose, let us say, India has a bilateral trade agreement with let's say, kind of, Bangladesh. In that case, whatever would be the balances. Suppose India has a surplus, it doesn't have to be immediately settled. It can be carried over, and settlement can take place by India demanding some Bangladesh goods which they are willing to sell, so that it can be bilaterally settled without necessarily requiring Bangladesh to pay dollars to India or India to pay dollars. So I dollar hegemony can be got rid of only over a period if we have bilateral trade agreements and remove dollar from the role of international medium of circulation. All this, however, is going to take time. Of course, I'm not in between. Of course, the global south would be very badly hurt by all these Trump measures which are taking place, because of which our exports to the US are going to suffer badly. Therefore, our unemployment situation would become worse. Our debt repayment would become that much more difficult. All this is going to immediately happen. But I think its happening should actually be converted into an opportunity for changing tracks, an opportunity for developing a strategy of growth that is really much more dependent on improving the living conditions of the people and improving the size of the home market. You see, as one of the speakers pointed out, export-led growth basically means that we have to squeeze each other's wages in order to be able to compete internationally. India has to lower its wages so that it can outcompete Bangladesh. Bangladesh has to do the same so that it can outcompete India. It's fundamentally not something which is a strategy of growth for an independent, post-colonial society. Finally, India-US agreement is going to hurt the farmers, you see, because there's a fiddle here. All of international economic relations are based on, as I said, fiddles worked out by imperialism. The WTO was based on a fiddle. That fiddle was that income transfers to farmers, like happens in the West, like happens in the US, in Europe, and so on, are non-price distorting, and therefore they're allowed. Income transfers through the procurement prices, support prices, are price distorting and therefore should be done away with. Okay. Now, this was a way of squeezing the Indian farmers so that American highly subsidized grains could come to the Indian market, and Indian farmers could then move away from grain production to producing other kinds of agricultural goods which they want. Now, the point is that in a period in which, suppose this happens, suppose the agricultural goods they produce and export to the American markets, there's a world market price crash, because cash crop prices, as you know, fluctuate greatly. In such a case, they would not have the purchasing power to buy food grains. India would not have enough foreign exchange to buy food grains from the market, and famines would happen. In fact, the Indian economist who passed away recently, Omnio Bagchi, has the term called globalization famines. Famines which are encouraged by the fact of globalization and through the undermining of food self-sufficiency and food security. That's what they want to undermine. And therefore, any trade agreement with the US is something which is going to be inimical to Indian farmers, which is why the farmers are protesting against it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Now the questions are for Professor Radhika Desai. Ma'am, this is the common question. What can we expect? Can we expect this trade war to evolve into a situation where inter-imperialist rivalries will become significant again? If so, can global labor and solidarity be strengthened again through traditional Leninist strategies or newer innovative forms of struggle? Then there's a similar question. What could be the structural solution globally to overcome out of the clutches of imperialism? And then, ma'am, since you're also part of the Manifesto Solidarity group, can you also throw some light on this question from Bolivia? How to promote solidarity and organization in global South? I mean, yeah, to overcome the crisis. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let me just take these and you also asked me about Canada and being anti-US. So I'll take all of these 4 questions. So first, maybe about inter-imperialist rivalries. I would on this point beg to differ slightly from Prabhat. I feel that anti-imperialist rivalries never went away. They were always there. It's just that in the immediate post-Second World War period, Europe and Japan were so weakened, particularly with their main engines of growth, namely Germany and Japan in East Asia, were weakened, subordinated to the United States, demilitarized, and so on. But if you look at what the United States, for example, has tried to do to Germany most recently, with essentially demanding that it cut off its access to Russian energy, which is the mainstay of German growth. I mean, what that's a form of aggression. There's not necessarily an alliance of imperial powers. I think there are clearly relations of domination and subordination even among them, and that's it's also interesting, for example, that no sooner had Trump announced his tariffs than Japan, South Korea, and China held talks with one another about how they were going to deal with this. I mean, I'm just giving scattered instances. You can take other instances. In the post Second World War period, France was responsible for causing the crisis of the gold-linked dollar. France also took itself out of NATO's military command structures, etc., etc. So there is great evidence for inter-imperialist rivalries. And I would say that today what's happening is that the rest of the developed capitalist countries are facing the question as to exactly what they will replace their alliance with the United States with, and this is an interesting question. But as I say, I don't think they ever went away. And as far as international finance capital is concerned, yes, it's true that once the United States and the United Kingdom in particular led the way to financialization, it seems as though substantial parts of the Japanese and the German bourgeoisies had succumbed to that. But it is again not clear to me that they have entirely succumbed, or that succumbing to it is going to do anything other than accelerate their own evolution towards the type of unsustainable financialization from which both the UK and the US economies are suffering. So anyway, and also this finance capital, I also don't like to use the term finance capital, which Hilferding evolved to denote a very different type of finance bank industry relations than exist today in the United States or the UK. In the United States and the UK today, there is basically no relation between banks and industry, and only the banks are engaged in speculation and predatory lending. Whereas the kind of finance capital of which Hilferding spoke was actually involved actively in the productive expansion of capital. And I think that's very different. And I think we should retain that difference precisely because this distinction is central to strategies to come out of this crisis into which we have all been landed. And it's not just related to Trump. I mean, imperialism has been getting more aggressive, more dangerous for a very long time. So okay. So that's my answer to the first set of questions. My answer to the question of Canada being and I also would like to say one other thing, which is that I personally think that the term globalization should not really be used. The term globalization is kind of really distracting. It gives you the impression that you know something when in fact it prevents you from answering all the questions you should be answering. So let me just give you one example of it. Most people who subscribe to the notion of globalization tend to imagine that production has become globalized, and Western corporations are investing in third world countries, and that this is taking jobs away to the south. But just take a look at this graph, which unfortunately only goes to 2018, but it kind of does the job. So this is a graph of inward foreign direct investment as a percentage of total gross fixed capital formation or total investment in any set of countries. So there is the blue line for the world, the orange line for developing countries, the gray line for transition economies, and the yellow line for developed countries. And you can see that even at their peak, and most of the time, of course, the levels were much lower, but even at their peak, the couple of peaks that you see here, the highest figure doesn't go above 20% or so. So the overwhelming majority of investment in any country is domestic. It's not foreign. And you can see that most of the time the averages are somewhere between 5 and 10%. So you can see this just gives you one measure of, that countries were not so globalized. But let me then continue to the question of global labor and solidarity. Here I'm in complete agreement with Prabhat and all the different thinkers that have been mentioned in this regard. Samir Amin, delinking, developmental state strategies, welfare state strategies. These are all the things we need. And in order to implement these things, we absolutely need to have a government that is responsible to the people, rather than a government that is responsible to an ever narrower, ever unproductive, ever more predatory capitalist class. But that's really a big political project. Yes, please remind me if I forget something. So I'll just for now, just answer the Canada-US thing. I think that there is no doubt that there has always been a healthy amount of anti-Americanism among the ordinary people of Canada. Canadians define themselves as essentially, not being Americans, and so on. However, I would say two things to qualify this. Number one, since 1988, at least, when Canada signed the first, U.S.-Canada free trade agreement, which was then followed a few years later by NAFTA, since that time, the Canadian capitalist class has essentially hitched its wagon to the United States. And I don't think that this is going to change soon. So what we've seen in the recent elections is Mark Carney, who is really, he poses as this, great crisis intervener and manager of crises and so on. Quite frankly, he managed nothing. He didn't manage to undo Brexit, and his, thankfully, the Canadian Canadian financial sector was not particularly invested in the toxic securities generated by the US system. So there was no crisis to manage. I mean, there was a small crisis, but not much of a crisis to manage. So he exaggerates it. What he's done as a representative of the kind of globalist, I see globalism as a project, not as a reality. So the globalist capitalist class, he is a representative of that, and he has used this anti-American sentiment to get what seems to amount to a minority government position. We haven't got the full details yet, but I think it'll probably remain at a minority government position. However, once in power, because he represents the same capitalist class which is deeply invested in the United States, he's going to do a deal with the United States, which is not going to change anything. The answer to the question, will Canada become the 51st state? I would say, well, isn't it already the 51st state? So, and it would need, again, another government that is actually that represents the interests of ordinary Canadians to be in power for this situation to change. I think those are the questions that were asked of me. So maybe I should end here. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Desai. Dr. Ahilan?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there is a question on, I mean, though you can choose not to answer, but they want to know one of the audience wants to know the functioning of the JVP's performance and what is the socialist path that it is laying for the future. Yeah, that's one question particularly. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe I'll come to that question as well, but kind of more generally responding to some of the questions. I see the 2020s as much like the 1930s as a time of great unraveling of the global order. And I think now we are seeing already the signs of inter-imperialist rivalry, but I think it could go much further. In other words, the kind of specter of fascism is also a possibility. I mean, I think so. The 2020s, in retrospect, few decades down, we might be looking back and thinking of as a time of much more destruction and much different political projects as well. The 2020s in Sri Lanka, it's been also a time of great crisis. We're going through the worst economic crisis since independence in the 1930s. And it was inevitable that there would be this major political change for a party that is completely out of elite politics and a party that led two major insurrections to come to power. While that kind of change did take place, it is also the character of the 2020s that there isn't the kind of alternative, a global alternative or a vision or an ideology that is very much present in people's lives for this kind of a party or this kind of a change to go forward. So what has been the reality over the last 6 months since the NPP government came to power? They are still stuck in an IMF program with austerity measures and without taking forward an alternative approach. So in that sense, it's been a very limited change, but the hope is that these are still early days that would see that shift. And I think this month has been perhaps in a way a welcome shock in terms of what the main path that was being pushed by the IMF of export-led growth, I think is for everyone to see that process has collapsed, and it's high time that the new government shifts out of the IMF program. Now, the positive sign in terms of this government is their emphasis on agriculture and the food system. And as Prabhat has been emphasizing, in our part of the world, that is so significant for our working people. And it is, even in agriculture and food, we have not achieved self-sufficiency where we could. I always make the case, if you take Sri Lanka is an island nation, when it comes to seafood, during the 2010s, we were exporting $250 million in seafood. We were importing $200 million in seafood, the low value, high quantity that our people are dependent on for their own nutrition. So there is a food crisis. So one would be, when I talk about self-sufficiency, and there was a question in the chat about, what kind of self-sufficiency, I think we would have to start with agricultural production and the food system. And there, I think the new government has an emphasis on cooperatives and cooperatives forms of production, which also ties in with the idea of self-sufficiency. But these are early days in terms of whether that kind of a structural change in the economy with respect to agriculture, food system, and cooperatives would be taken forward. The last point I want to say is that, who has also gained in small states like us over the last 4.5 decades of neoliberalism. Our local financiers have also extracted quite a bit. Our local financial class in the global south have also consolidated their wealth, and they are not being hit by this debt crisis. In fact, many of them are even extracting through amidst this debt crisis that is affecting the global south. So when I started with Marx's quote about, that every proletariat has to settle with its own bourgeoisie, it's also about finance in our part of the world. So I think the question of redistribution is crucial between the metropolis and the periphery, but also within countries. And imperialism is a barrier for redistribution at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kadi Gamar. Now, I invite all of you to give your closing remarks. Before that, just make a small announcement. Tomorrow at, again, 5:30, we have the third webinar. It's on geopolitical fallout, multipolarity, and the erosion of US dominance. Then on May 1st, we have, coinciding with the International Labor Day, Global South Perspectives, Resistance and Survival. So I request all of you to please join us tomorrow and day after, and I invite our speakers to give their concluding remarks briefly. Thanks. Yeah, with the same order that you presented.
Okay, I'll be extremely brief. I see the current period as one of great hardships for the working people, particularly in the global south, in countries like my own, in India, and so on. But on the other hand, I also see this as the beginning of a new era of change, that capitalism, particularly neoliberalism, is in such a deep crisis that it cannot on its own come out of this crisis. It has to be transcended, and that transcendence is one that I believe would logically in steps take us towards socialism. So I actually see this as a kind of, as a kind of terminal situation for neoliberal capitalism, from which no matter how painful, we are going to make a transition towards socialism.
I guess I should say I couldn't agree more. I think this is exactly right. And I would just add a couple of more points to that. I think that not only neoliberal capitalism is in crisis, but I don't think you can have any other type of capitalism today. So that capitalism is in crisis. So that's the first point. Secondly, I think the crisis is so deep, and I'm very glad that Ahilan Ambedkar mentioned fascism. Prabhat also, of course, has written a lot about this. And part of the reason I was very careful to note that it is not clear to me that Trump is even under the control of the CEOs and big corporate capitalists who put him in power, because it is one of the characteristics of fascism that fascist leaders come to power at a time when the ruling class has lost its ability to retain control over political processes. And when it does that, it resorts to this maverick force that emerges and promises to restore some sort of control, and they reach for it. But of course, given the very nature of this force, which has come to power through very risky political means, then it's not clear that the capitalist class can easily control it. It's a bit like, who rides the tiger dare not dismount. So it's the capitalist class is in that sort of position. And I think there are elements of that in the Trump situation. And then finally, I did see that somebody asked me to answer the question about China and socialism. So while I completely agree with Prabhat, and I would say that if you are happy with what Prabhat is saying, I'm not going to argue with you. I'm okay with that interpretation, but I might might suggest that we might go a step further. I mean, I think that, of course, China is not perfect. And I think somebody in the chat noted that, China says, China doesn't say it's socialist, it says it's building socialism. So how credible is that? And so that's the benchmark against which we have to judge China. And the simple way of thinking about it is that, yes, there are lots of capitalists in China. Yes, some of them are extremely big and powerful. There are mega capitalists, big corporate CEOs, and so on. Yes, they are also politically very influential. Many of them have been invited into the Communist Party, etc. But at the end of the day, what distinguishes China is that China controls the capitalist class. It tells the capitalist class what it can do and cannot do. It can call Jack Ma on the carpet and say, you will not have this IPO, etc., etc. Whereas in most capitalist societies today, it is the capitalist class that is in control of the state. And I think this is the key difference. And I have no doubt that there are powerful lobbies in China which would dearly love to take China down the neoliberal road. But if they succeed, first of all, China's exceptional economic performance, spectacular economic performance will very soon end. And of course, if they do, then I would no longer say that China is meaningfully socialist. But in this respect, in this sense, I would certainly say that China is meaningfully socialist. It does have some overall level of planning, including planning, I think, for technological innovation, which is very much in evidence these days. So I think that in these senses, we should take it seriously. It still has a long way to go before it can become paradise. Another problem is that China still has a lot of inequality, which is, which needs to be addressed. So, yeah, there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I will also be very brief. I think 2 points. As I think all of us agree, these are very tumultuous times. There can be now Sri Lanka conceivably voted in a progressive government, but these are also times when there can be huge swings. And because these are also times that are ripe for the right to come back amidst this kind of crisis. So I think, and these are going to be hard times for the working people. And in that context, it's very important to strengthen democracy in our countries, people's democracy, because we are up against very hard times. One. Two, these are also times when there's going to be major maneuvers by global powers, regional powers, who could end up trying to undermine smaller states. So I think this is also a time for the need for a new Bandung spirit of alliances and solidarity among smaller states with the kind of a project of delinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahilan. On this note, I'll just summarize what is to be done, shared by Professor Prabhat Patnaik, Radhika, and Dr. Ahilan. Small countries come together, break the hegemony of the global north, have bilateral agreements to overcome the crisis, de-dollarize, control of capital flows, then self-sufficiency in food and agriculture production. Dr. Desai talked about seeing fascism as a threat. Everybody should come together, and democratic voices have to be strengthened. And Dr. Ahilan similarly talked about democracy needs to be strengthened in all our spaces and form global networks. And yes, that is the challenge that we have. And thank you, everyone, for joining from different parts of the world. On behalf of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, I thank our speakers, the audience, and our technical team for making this possible. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, comrades. Great job, Ambedkar.
Yeah, but it's so scary.
No, that's okay.
It's still recording. We can stop recording on Record.